You are listening to the Mindset Forge podcast. I'm Barton Bryan, your host. As always, another episode, athletes and performing artists talking about how they show up big for the moments that matter most and their backstory, how they came to be in the sport or the art form that they're doing. This interview is with Mark Fisher. He's the founder of Mark Fisher Fitness in New York City, and it has a fantastic story about being an actor and finding how he wanted to help actors and artists in New York City discover fitness and create a unique space for them to really thrive with all the creativity and outrageousness that you might expect from actors and theater people in the New York area. So we're going to go into his backstory, how he got into theater. I really feel like a great conversation, just looking at the world of acting, performance, and just the benefit of how theater and performance and putting yourself in a place where you can really fully live out your emotions is actually such a great way to understand yourself and to be a more complete and well-rounded human being, in your own life. You can find a lot more about Mark Fisher by going to markfisherfitness.com or check out his Instagram page. It's MFF Clubhouse on Instagram. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and like the video on YouTube so that more people can see it. All right, buckle up. Here we go with Mark Fisher.
Well, hey, Mark, thank you for being here. I want to jump right into it. You are you're literally a unicorn in so many ways, and that word will come up later. But I want to really go into this fact that my whole premise with the podcast is athletes and performing artists, and really the mindset of both types of people out there that are really competing at a high level or performing at a high level, and just how they do it, and some of the magic that comes from being at a high level in those different ways. And rarely do I come across somebody who is truly, kind of a hybrid of both. And Mark, you are that person, and so super excited to talk to you about your acting career. Kind of what got you into that world, and then your current situation with Mark Fisher Fitness and what you're doing with that and all that kind of stuff. So first of all, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, hey, let's go back, man. Early days of acting, what was the spark? What was the thing about acting that just caught you and took you for that ride?
Well, I think it was the opportunity to pretend I was someone else, which is dark, but that's precisely what it was. I don't think that's particularly uncommon, as you know, for
Sure.
actors, that the spark is a desire for life that has some consequence and drama that would take me away from my boring, challenging, somewhat isolated, lonely childhood into the world of, because of the era I was born in, the world of maybe Steven Spielberg movies or G.I. Joe, or something that allowed me to experience life outside the small and what seemed to be limited sphere that I was living in, at least as compared to access to these fantasy, larger, more dramatic worlds that movies and TV were a window into. So I think that's very much what got me involved. In many ways, it was frankly just an extension of my love of toys. I can remember being a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, and just so into, once again, the toys that boys of that era were into, and loving playing pretend with them, and just thinking, gosh, it would be so cool if I could make a living playing pretend. And this is all I could do is just make and tell cool stories.
Did your parents see that in you and kind of help guide you into theater, or was that something you had to really find for yourself in your childhood?
I was always very driven and quite type A in many ways. So I would say that my parents were reasonably supportive of it. They never did follow through on my solicitations from the age of 6 or 7 to bring me to the city to get an agent, because as a 6 or 7-year-old, I knew that was an important thing. And I grew up in southern New Jersey, so to their defense, it was a 90-plus minute ride to the city, nor did they know anyone, nor in practice is it actually that simple to go to the city and get an agent. But even from a young age, that was the thing I was constantly asking them for, because I was really hoping and wanted to and ready to be a child actor if that was the path that was viable for me. Now, as it happened, that was not the circumstance that I grew up in. That wasn't really a thing that was realistic for my parents. And when I got into middle school was when I really, really got into theater, because I can remember as early as fifth grade doing the plays and getting to be the Nutcracker and Uncle Sam and the whatever, American Spectacular thing that we did in the spring as the fifth grade class. And that was a great, I think, first opportunity to experience what live theater was, because, of course, there's a meaningful difference for performing for a camera versus a live audience, right? And then when I got into middle school, then I had the opportunity to start doing plays and musicals, and at first found myself very reluctantly getting into singing because it seemed that, well, this is what I have to do, because if I want to do plays, they don't do a lot of quote-unquote straight plays in my area. I'm going to have to do musicals, and I'm going to have to learn to sing. And I fell in love with it, actually. And I think there was a number of things that went into it. I think certainly that whole experience was very informed by the community that is a really meaningful part of a theater experience. I think for most people that like theater, to feel seen and to feel known and to find peers that shared my passions and my values, because that was not, I think, a thing I had experienced, certainly not with that richness, until I fell into the theater career. So I think that was a piece of it. I think anytime you're getting positive feedback about something, particularly something like that's quite powerful. And I remember there was particularly hilariously, when I was in seventh grade in my middle school, we strangely did a show that was scenes from 4 different musicals, which I'm pretty sure is probably some kind of copyright violation. But one of the ones we did was Little Shop of Horrors. Right, it's probably illegal. You're probably not allowed to do that. Pretty sure you have to pay royalties usually. But I think that was a different climate. In fact, I have friends now that run musical theater camp for kids, and it's a whole different, it's a very, very different world than when I was a child. But I had the opportunity to do the dentist from Little Shop of Horror, and I remember that was a particular watershed, because it occurred to me that girls would be interested. Yes, so I got to be Steve Martin in the movie, and I got to be full ham Mark, and funny and over the top, and it was very, very well received by people that were not in the theater community. And that was very interesting, because that, of course, was peak insecurity moment of life, right? Like, that's a very difficult age for most of us. In fact, my understanding, there's now some research that suggests people often overweight their familial and parental relationships when they're ascribing meaning to how they become the way they are. And in practice, a lot of that actually is very specifically the formative years of prepubescent, when you begin to understand yourself in a social context. So that era of my life, I remember there's a very balanced between feeling very isolated, very lonely, very out of place, and then this strange lightning in a bottle experience of doing theater, where miraculously it seemed all my dreams were coming true. And I felt this deep validation from my peer group after previously feeling somewhat anonymous, somewhat awkward. And that, I think all of those factors combined led me to really falling in love with the theater. It had a lot going for it.
Yeah, I think people that have never done theater, they don't know that experience. Like you talked about, in the midst of a show, that the company, the community that's built and that creates almost a family feel.
Yes.
And it's different from like having a job and then leaving the job, because nobody wants to leave. Like nobody wants the show to be over. It's like this, you get so connected, you get so bought into this idea, this performance, this nightly thing, and then it's over. And everyone's like devastated, but it's this magical connection. And in school, for people like, mentioning yourself, like feeling, and I felt that way. I didn't have theater in junior high. I was a basketball player, and that's all I had. And I wish I had music and theater at that point, because I probably would have survived a little bit better. But you have this community where it's like, yes, like people get me maybe for the first time.
Yes.
And I've seen that with some of my friends' kids, like that socially awkward found theater and just like transformed the way they see themselves, the way and that community and all that kind of stuff. And so, and then to have a pivotal role like, the dentist, you're not just getting validation from your peers, but you're getting that like external validation. Like, and your parents, at least my parents, like when I did an opera at Cal State Northridge, they could come and they didn't know anything about opera, but they could see me as Dr. Bartolo in Marriage of Figaro. And they could it was easy for them to tell people, my son's, performing in an opera, like he was this, and it becomes much they start validating you because they start telling everybody like, hey, he's really doing stuff. He's not just,
right,
fumbling around. Right. So, and you're New York adjacent. I grew up in Northern California, too far away from LA to really like think about LA. But 90 minutes from New York City, you've got Broadway, you've got all this, you've got professional acting at its, it's the kind of pinnacle. So you're really, you're as a 6-year-old, you're thinking about, I got to find an agent, I got to get to New York. How do I do this? How does that play out, as you get into your teenage years and closer to graduation from high school?
Yeah, I think, by the time I was in high school, my recollection is at that point, I was no longer really trying to push my parents into taking me into the city. I accepted it wasn't happening. And I was just all in on the theater community. And one thing that was fortunate for me in the area I lived in, we had a pretty decent theater program in my high school. We had a community theater group that was pretty well organized and put together. And then there was also, at various points, a third community theater group in my township. So I was getting to do a lot of shows. So throughout high school, my focus shifted less away from being brought to the city to have the opportunity to audition to really focusing very seriously on what did I need to do to become competitive as a musical theater actor, which for me meant studying not just acting and taking improv classes, but also studying music quite seriously and really studying to be a singer. And that led me into, of course, by senior year, I had done enough research. Again, being pretty aggressively goal-driven even at that age, have really done a lot of work to find out, okay, what are the most competitive schools? Where should I go to? So I auditioned at maybe 7 or 8 schools, ultimately came down to deciding between New York University, though at NYU, it would have been the Stellar Adler program, not Cap 21, which is the musical theater conservatory. And ultimately, I decided to go to Syracuse University in part because I knew I was going to move to the city for forever, in part because New York City was $1 zillion even at that time. And I was drawn to have the opportunity to have a more traditional university experience. And Syracuse was a great school, and it is a somewhat iconic. There's many other schools, I think, that fit that category, but like a big university, lots of programs. They're good at a lot of different things in a lot of the different departments, and it was amazing. I had a great time, and I loved being there and loved that program.
There's something to be said about, kind of being insulated into the program versus being in New York City where it's like everything is going on. There's so much to distract you in the world of theater. Like you go to a place like Syracuse, maybe you have a little bit more of a kind of a bubble that you can live in really, because in the growth of an artist, you really need that safe place to grow and to really explore and become yourself. Talk about how that happened for you, at Syracuse.
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, I suspect if I had gone to NYU and not have known any differently, that I presume that it's possible there's ways in which they create some of that there. But I think you're absolutely correct. My experience at Syracuse was very much a feeling of being enveloped in a womb of theater. That was all I thought about. It was all I did. I passed out of all of my academic credits except for 3 credits because I took a bunch of AP classes and I was a little nerdy nerd. So I didn't actually have to take anything besides theater classes. So I used all my credits to just double up and take all the things, everything from theater history classes to taking extra dance classes. So I essentially turned that program into a conservatory. And as it happens, Syracuse, and my understanding this is similar for many of these almost conservatories within these larger university settings, the drama program was almost like its own frat. So there were maybe, I want to say around 250 students in the drama program. And the theater school was attached to the Syracuse stage and was also physically isolated, not far, maybe a 15-minute walk, but a far enough walk from the rest of the university that we essentially had our own world as the theater kids. And I had the opportunity to really just eat, sleep, and breathe theater and performance nonstop. And it was incredible. And it was in many ways like college times 10, because now not only were we only focusing on theater all the time, but we were all attempting to pursue it professionally. We were all very serious and very passionate about it. And not that we didn't really engage with the rest of the university. We did from time to time, but it was a very insular program in a way that, for me, I liked, is my life has largely been defined by a succession of cults, a succession of like deep friendships, deep everything from, what Mark Fisher Fitness became to a lot of my friend groups in New York City to even now being an avid burner and part of the Burning Man community in New York City. And Syracuse University was a very rich experience of that. And in addition to learning a lot about acting, I think I've learned a lot about as a human. And I always do give credit to that learning experience, both the formal and informal learning experience at Syracuse, for shaping who I became as an entrepreneur. Because, of course, many of the skills that I use in my day-to-day professional life now came directly from that. Some of them are very obvious in that a lot of what I do professionally, certainly my consulting work, is speaking, which is certainly a kind of performance. And it does give me something of an unfair advantage because being a classically trained actor and having 10 years experience as a professional actor, I got a lot of reps being alone with hundreds of people looking at me by myself. And that is a skill that I've leveraged to great effect. But I would also say even something like marketing, I think, lends itself to someone with a background as an actor, because if marketing is entering the conversation going on in your prospect or your client's head, that's what acting is. You get this text, you analyze it. What does the playwright say about this character? What do the other characters say? What does this character say about themselves? How do I fill this in with the more given circumstances and really create a real human story around this individual? And that's a lot of why I think as soon as I got into marketing, I had some success because, to some extent as a actor, to be unbearably pretentious, to quote Anton Artaud, but actors are athletes of the heart. So your ability to be empathetic and really think through what it's like to be that other person is useful in marketing and sales. And it's also useful when you run a team, because I think another advantage that I had is acting requires one to be in a flow state of deep listening and complete focus and attentional awareness. When you're on stage with someone, nothing else matters. That's not to say that one's mind never drifts. It's not to say that like you never have a moment where you're like, what am I going to do for dinner after the show, right? But for the most part, it's a flow state. You are committing your attentional awareness to that moment and deep attention, so you're able to be super locked into the person you're performing with. And I think that is very valuable, because I would say that when you are in, let's say, a high stakes conversation with an employee or a client, there's something to be said for blocking out the rest of the world and giving your entire soul force and looking deeply at every micro expression, listening to everything this person is saying. And I certainly don't presume to say that I pick up on everything all of the time. I think I can still sometimes be a little bit dense because I have a very strong executive mode and function in my brain that's not always zoomed out with a soft focus, or what cognitive scientists call the default mode network. I sometimes realize like, oh, I guess I didn't realize I pissed that person off with what I said. But I think had I not been an actor, I think I would have been a disaster at it, because acting forced me to learn the skill of full body attentional listening. And that is, I think, incredibly important for everything one does in business.
Yeah, I mean, with acting, if your character is very like executive type or driven, they may push their objective, in a scene, and the action is not to listen really, but to push. But the actor has to be able to really take in and just experience and be present. And so like having both of those, I mean, I think that's interesting that you're talking about like the executive side of yourself, which is the driven, let's get shit done, but then you got to work with the team, and you've got to like, kind of feel the emotions of the room and kind of take people's kind of state of being into consideration, that kind of stuff. Yeah. I mean,
it's a good point. Yeah. It's
so much acting
is
that it's really, I mean, in so many ways, like a safe place to kind of learn human interaction, like
100%.
The stakes, you know what? If I mess up the scene, I'm not going to die, right? Like, but I can give in completely to the moment, try to like just let things happen and experience that kind of, that, a lot of people have an issue with, like, I just, in general, people are, conflict, and in life, they freeze up, they're quiet, they shut down. But in acting, you can have a place where like, hey, you know what? My character is going to see this conflict through, and he's going to have his point of view, and he's going all the way with it.
Yes.
And that's not dangerous. That's not going to, kind of break my kind of protection or whatever that thing is that we have in a real life. So it's a practice. There's a lot of practice built into it.
Yeah, you really are encouraged, I think, as an actor to be a student of life, of a student of yourself, of a student of the world. I've often thought a model that feels correct to me, that acting in many ways allowed me to spend the first, let's call it, third of my life with deep experiential studying of the human experience, where I was studying humans. That would not say there was no intellectual component, but acting at its best is not an intellectual exercise, right? You don't, by definition, you want to be what actors call in your head. You're pretending you're someone else, and if you're lucky, and certainly you get to do a lot of this in a conservatory, this tends to be a little harder for practical reasons once you graduate, but you're pretending you're these wildly different people. You're exploring different parts of yourself, and I think there's real benefit. I think that changes people. I think by definition, people who are good actors understand how much possibility there is for not only different humans to look at the world in very different ways with very different values, but another thing that's useful about acting is you understand that you can, through the force of your will and belief, decide for the purposes of this audition that this person you have just met is your father, and you have created a story you've just chosen to be true, and it has such reality for you that you can, in this artificial setting with the producers looking at you, actually move yourself to real tears and feel a real emotional experience purely because you've decided that to be true. And I think a takeaway from that is that you actually always have that power. The only difference is we don't identify most of our identity and most of our belief systems as these things that can be malleable. In many ways, it brings to mind Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is this amazing book that I suspect some listeners have read. This is a harrowing tale of a psychologist's experience in the Holocaust. And his core distinction was that in this experience, if people are able to feel bliss, that means that there is a space between a stimulus and our response, what we make it to mean. And in acting, you're literally making things mean different things and having actual physiological, biochemical, emotional experiences to them. And certainly there's some distinction, of course, because when the scene is over, you exhale and it's like the tide going out and you can go on your day. I think when something is happening in the real world, it I think correctly has more emotional valence and doesn't float away. But nonetheless, I think that experience is educational, and I think can create maybe other possibilities for any human, and it's interesting. I'm curious here if you have had experience as an actor, have any reflections on that half-baked thought.
No, well, it's I was thinking about, I was just listening to a podcast. They were talking about people who are depressed, right? And their wiring is really like they're boxed in, like they're boxed in because they always do things like a stimulus comes, they respond the same way every time. It creates a negative experience, a negative emotion, and they feel stuck. And so they're, of course, now they're using psychedelics, mushrooms, things like that to kind of stretch people and get their headspace into a place where the brain actually rewires in a kind of exploratory way.
Yes.
And when I was listening to that, I thought to myself, that's kind of what acting does. Like if I have if I'm somebody, like I just talking personally about myself, I grew up, older brother felt like really kind of, kind of a bully, whatever. But like that experience made me like strong and like guarded. Right. And so here I am in New York at the Maggie Flanagan acting studio doing Meisner and just trying to let it go. And, I was always, okay, how do I just break this stuff down? How do I get through it and just like completely give in? And with these scenes that we would do and the understanding that it was safe, the understanding that I could fully like whether it was to like be heartbroken, to be, fully angry,
Yes.
fully enraged, whatever it was, like
Yes.
I was able to kind of, but what I learned is that, and I had to do a lot of like body work pre performance. So that's where I got really into the physicality of warming up, meditation, things like that can soften my kind of, my psyche in a sense, and my body, so that I could truly kind of take in and experience. But in doing those things, I felt like I truly, like, those became a part of me too. Like, I don't think our psyche really, our, whatever that thing is that's our creative self, knows the difference between, in this scene, I went for it and I felt that, and I wasn't like, it reminded me, hey, you know what, you did that, and it wasn't life and death. You didn't, like, whatever that thing you think was going to happen didn't happen. And that was a positive experience.
Yeah, it is interesting that acting requires one to unearth states of being, feelings, even physical sensations of emotions in the body are a requirement. And to your point, safe to do so. Now, it's interesting, of course, because I'm sure you've experienced too, there are, of course, people that are aspiring actors, and that's the thing that they can't do. It's the thing that gets in the way. There's certain ways of being, there's certain states that are blocked to them, and whether they need, talk therapy or some sort of somatic release. I think your point about physicality is very important too. I've always been very interested in a lot of the physical schools of theater. At college, we studied a lot of the Meyerhold work, but certainly Anne Bogard's work, that like deeply physical theater and getting into a character through its physicality. At this point in my life, it's interesting as I sort of look back and try to get all these threads together. There are things about that are almost reminiscent of some of the work I've been engaged with, if you're familiar with the Everyman framework or the movement over the past several years to create these men's group, because for a lot of men, and notably, this has not been my personal experience. And I often feel quite othered about this because I think we're trying to be less stereotypical. But a stereotypical thing you hear is men don't have emotions. The only thing men have is anger. And well, Barton, I don't mind sharing this with you, and I think you might suspect this. That has not been my experience. My experience has been not that I do not have emotions. I am not at a loss for emotional vocabulary, for being able to notice and experience where it's happening in my body. And that's another thing, too, that I have wondered at this point in my life. I can't reverse engineer how much of that is a correlation where I got into acting because I had that tendency and acting allowed me to leverage it, and how much of it causation, how much of it is my work as an actor in ways maybe good and not always helpful, opened me up to a greater sensitivity to a full palette, a full rainbow of emotions that certainly for probably our father's generation, but even today, I think for a lot of men, is not part of their experience as an emotional being in the world.
Yeah. Well, I think because we were in the theater, whether it was, is it cause or effect, like the experience of knowing that, like, emotions are like the keys on the piano, right? Like, if you love music totally. And you're a pianist, you're obsessed about the keys. Like, how do I get the 10th? Like, can I reach a 10th? Can I get this chord?
Right.
What about the minor 7th? Right. So you become you become an artist or an actor, and it's like the emotions. What can I experience? Where can I go? And it changes. It flips the whole mindset of a typical guy from like, I must be strong. I'm only going to play strong, alpha roles or whatever, some kind of construct of what we think strong male people are. And you go into this place of like, what if I felt this? What if I did this? What's possible? What can I do? And I think that's the magic of a great studio too, or a great program that you're in. It's like you're getting truthful responses, not just from your teachers, but from your fellow peers saying like, yes, that was great. Like, more of that.
Yes. Agreed.
But if you didn't do theater your whole life, like, so, my dad was a musician. So there was like in my house, even though I was an athlete, basketball, there was just arts and that world was there. Like, it was something that was important from a very early age. even though like I wasn't pushed to do that stuff, or it came later in my life, it was definitely something that like that's important too. Like that should be looked at or considered. But I don't think a lot of people have that. It's be strong. It's be this. Don't show emotion. Yeah. And so absolutely, I haven't heard that much about these types of groups. Go into this, this concept and what you're trying to help these men kind of experience or unveil.
Yeah, well, the first thing I should share as a caveat is I by no means presume to be an expert on this kind of work. And I can share that I have, for many years now, been involved in something called the Entrepreneurs Organization, and the small group forum that I'm in happens to be all men. And that's been a really beautiful container, as one says in these types of spaces, for us to talk about what they call the top 5% and the bottom 5%. That's hyper confidential, and you get to say the scariest things out loud, and you will be challenged, and it will be named if your brothers sense you're not being completely honest about really what's going on. Because of course the things we can't say hold all our power, right? And pain shared is pain divided. So that's been a really powerful thing. But men's groups, I've actually really only just joined one literally 2 months ago. And this particular group of individuals, a lot of dear friends in my social community, many of them are very high level entrepreneurs. Virtually all of us go to Burning Man. We exist in the same large Brooklyn community of people around my age, virtually all of whom run businesses that share an approach to life and a culture, and it is yet another cult. And through them, I've had the opportunity to join their men's group where we meet once per week. And the Everyman Framework, and again, I hope I'm not completely pasteurized because this is all new, but it is at its heart really an opportunity to create spaces where men with other men engage in a process of healing, of growing, of softening the places that are too hard, and in some cases toughening up the places that are too soft. And a lot of that is done by focusing on what's going on with our emotions and developing that emotional vocabulary and doing a number of different very specific set of structured exercises to really get in touch with, in a somatic sense, what's going on in the body, what's really showing up for you, and learning how to say that out loud in a space where like that is safe, where that was, it's interesting as I say this out loud, it's interesting. It's almost not like acting, right? It's another way of how do we create a space where it is safe to, I think, as you so eloquently put it, play all the keys of the keyboard. If there are keys of the keyboard that we just don't have access to, that we don't feel safe to feel, that we don't feel safe to express, that piano it can't play music the way that it otherwise could. And it's going to be, I think, a very interesting maybe 30 years here to see how this impacts subsequent generations. Because the thing that I find continually astonishing is the number of men I know that engage in a thoughtful way with a real deep sense of their emotions, with a real willingness and ability to be vulnerable when they're scared, to come to a way to honestly learn how to express their anger, which I'll say someone for me, that's always been a challenge that I have had. I've seen anger be such a form of just violence and oppression for men. It has been difficult for me to make friends with my anger, which can be feels explosive and so potentially ruinous of everything around me. And when I think about our father's generations, perhaps, your family's maybe a little bit different if you have a musician dad. I will say that, my father's not a symphony of emotional articulation. And I feel optimistic about the world. I think these various self-help modalities, all of which have their limitations, I think correctly all have a lot of criticisms. I am heartened when I think of the men I know and I think of who they're aspiring to be in their partnerships, in their business dealings as fathers. And it makes me hopeful for what type of positive ripples that can compound into the next generation. Maybe that's me being like overly optimistic, but by wiring, I guess I believe in the infinite possibility of humans.
Yes. Well, look, you also have a brand new baby, right? How many weeks old now?
Yeah. She's 4.5 months now, 4.5 months.
Okay.
So we're into months. We're not even weeks anymore.
Well, I remember when my son Jack was born. He's 8 now, but like, my brain shifted. Like your thought of like, my dad did this or thought this, or my experience as a child was this, and what is my son or daughter's experience going to be?
Yes,
because of the work you've done, because of the experiences that you and your wife have had, and what you're bringing to the table. That's really the magic of like generational change. I think we're all this world right now with trying to really address all people and have respect and have perspective for all types of people.
Right.
Like, that's such a difficult thing to happen. Like right now in these 5-10 years that I think everyone wants to happen.
It's like the core, it's precisely the core issue in my estimation. Exactly that. It's like, we're all ready to go. And it's just like, it's just a lot of work. And it's like, we all have to do it. It's but yes, let's do it.
But that's the general, but I think what we often cannot truly understand is like, sometimes things just the pace of things is really a generational pace and not a like episodic pace that we want it to be. Like, next week it's going to be better.
That's completely my perspective. Yeah, and it's hard to swallow that. And I understand that, particularly for individuals that are suffering at the hands of some of these things that haven't been healed. I understand the reasons for some impatience and fire. And I think some of that is valuable too. And it occurs to me, not unlike one of my favorite things about business and perhaps, dare I say, life, is be impatient with process and patient with results, right? Like, do the work, but just give the results are just going to come. Everything is always going to happen slower than you want. And then it's going to happen all at once, right? And when we think on the time span of the human race, again, I feel hardened. If you're looking in a long enough timeline, if you zoom out and look at the trends, like, there's a lot of stuff I think is actually overall going the right way. And of course, if you zoom in close enough, similar to like a business, right? Ideally, it's going up and to the right. But if you look at any given week, the data can be very deeply upsetting. And it's not intuitive, perhaps, to think of humans on a time scan of hundreds of years. But presuming that we avoid any meaningful, actual game over ruin, any actual existential risk, a nuclear winter that drops below 500,000, or killer AI, which is its own amazing rabbit hole that very smart people are very, very worried about, incidentally. But assuming we don't do that, if we make it through these next few hundred years, my goodness gracious, my goodness, what kind of amazing possibilities do we have in front of us? And again, maybe we'll never get there, and maybe some future generation will somehow strike upon this podcast and be like, that guy was really overly optimistic. Things didn't change that much, but I don't know. I think that they could. But I think, to your point, it's not necessarily going to be obvious in the next 18 months. But I think in the next 200 to 300 years, I'm bullish. I'm long on humans.
And Mark, guess what? Your daughter, 40 years from now, can Google and find this podcast interview.
Yeah.
It's going to live forever. That's one of the magic things about podcasts. It's like, my son is going to have a library of just like cool interviews with all these people across the world, about
I
these
think
topics.
about that a lot, right? Fascinating.
But your daughter, maybe
it's
30
amazing.
years from now, is going to hear your point right there and be like, God, I like that. He's right.
Yeah, I'll tell you one practice I've taken up that I hope to continue. I did one before she was born, and my plan is every year on her birthday, I'm going to film her a video. And it will be twofold. It will be a chance for her to see who I was in that moment. I can't remember offhand now, but I created a number of like very simple prompts, which are like, what are you most looking forward to? What do I hope for you? Maybe like, what is a question I'm asking right now? What is something that I'm working through? What is a struggle I'm facing right now? It remains to be seen, of course, the what's entirely possible. She'll be so used to that thing with me, they'll be like, yeah, it's just like my dad always does stuff all the time. It's kind of insufferable, right? Whereas, like for me, I'm like, what if my father was able to tell me about his inner emotional life? How much closer we could be, And likely she'll be like, oh, Dad, I get it. You got feelings.
Right.
Anyway.
And unfortunately for us, because we want to be validated while we're alive, but I promise you,
of course,
passed away, right? Like if I found, reel-to-reel cassette or reel-to-reel tapes of my father, like talking to my brother and I, or telling stories, or whatever, like anything would be gold, right? Because those things don't exist. And like there was my mom or my dad told me about a letter he wrote to me when I was born in some crappy little notebook that he like kept somewhere in a drawer. He lost it. And so he never knew where it was. And then when he passed away, we were like ripping through all of his, just organizing, and we came across this little tiny notebook, and it was, March 5th, 1975. Dude, like, can you, like, unbelievable, dude. Like a grenade of, I just sat down, and it's like 4 days after my father passed away. And I'm just word by word by word trying to like, just let it just
incredible
pour over me and anyway, but so yes, do it.
Amazing. Yes, we'll do.
But unfortunately, it's probably like, it's that long game, right? It's all about the long game.
Yeah.
You do,
yeah, it really is.
They probably won't be here to experience when it truly hits. It truly has the impact.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, and I think again, in my most romantic moments brings to mind that beautiful phrase, plant trees you will never see.
Ooh,
plant trees you will never see.
Actors are athletes of the heart. Is that what the quote was? The other one I wanted to make.
Anton Artaud, who wrote the book The Theater and Its Double. Yes. A lot of his work was quite dark. It's funny that's Anton. A lot of his work was around the theater of cruelty and theater of alienation. I believe he was an influence on Brecht. It's funny, at this point in my life, too, I am a very obsessive reader and have been for many, many years. And I find I can almost no longer stomach business books anymore because I find them so the same thing. And it's often a book that probably should have been a PDF that a consultant is writing, because if he gets on the New York Times bestseller list by convincing all his friends to buy 50 to 100 copies and game the things, then he can charge $25,000 when he's doing these speaking gigs, these various Fortune 500 companies.
Right.
So I'm finding myself reading more and more completely random things. And there's one, it's 100%. And I, by the way, get it, everybody. And all the way, I also have found a lot of value in those books. But 12-year in at this point, I don't know there's a lot of brand new things I've not bumped into before. Certainly not that I can't execute better. That process never ends. But at this point, I feel like there's not a lot of new things I'm reading in new business books. I've never heard of this idea. Culture, what's that? However, I think it's very interesting now. I'm finding myself going back a lot to a lot of books from college and even high school and in my 20s. And of course, it's a very different experience reading them now. And of late, I'll tell you another thing that's sort of interesting. This is a time of conversation because I don't know that I'll ever actually do anything with it because the business is quite difficult. But the past 6 months, I've gone down a real rabbit hole studying the business of Broadway, which is a fascinating business because even more so than tech in some ways, it is way high risk and the return is massive. And ideally, of course, the reason to do business is not purely to make money, but the upside you can get if you're involved in a Broadway show as a producer, and admittedly, they don't happen a lot, but at the very least, I'm just so interested now to go back to the history of Broadway where I was completely uninterested in anything happening behind the scenes. As a 19-year-old, I did not care. I was interested in the creatives. I was interested in what's happening in the shows. So it's been so joyful and interesting to go back to read books about the history of the business of Broadway and suddenly learn about all these behind the scenes people that in many ways were, I wouldn't say are more influential than creatives, but were meaningfully a part of what Broadway is. And certainly I know my way around a P&L at this point, that's been really fun. Like, oh, this thing that I was obsessed with for the first 30 years of my life, I kind of moved away from to now go back into it with this existing skill set is interesting and may opening up, I think might open up a new chapter for me here at some point, but we'll see. We'll see. Got a lot on
my recent guest was talking about Newsies and how that show was really, nobody expected it. Like the producers at least didn't expect it to really go anywhere. It was just kind of something they put up there, like put up on Broadway, and it just wouldn't die. People loved it. It just became almost like a, to use your term, cult following. Like people just got, they just loved the show. It became a tour. It became a movie. All those types of things, and just the kind of magic of you find something that resonates with people. I have a friend who's a composer who's has not been on Broadway. He's a musical theater composer, but he's he just did Lampica and at the La Jolla Playhouse in San Diego, and they're working it towards, it's probably the next step, getting closer to Broadway and trying to get the production and the money behind it and all that. It's just, there's so much to that process of getting something, to actually open, and like, is it going to be successful, and getting the right actors.
Oh yeah. And it's so hard to know. It's not like like any business endeavor. In some ways, feels almost more extreme. What I find fascinating about Broadway shows, you can get together the best ingredients in the world, and for whatever reason, it just sucks. There are shows you get together where you're like, wow, every performer involved was amazing. All of these artists are at the top of the craft. Everyone in the creative team is as good as it gets. And this is terrible. This is a horrible show. And of course, that's what makes it interesting in many ways, I think. And there's something, again, that, romantic Mark pops his head up and says, isn't it so beautiful? This whole community of tens of thousands of artists every year suffer in this completely impractical, silly profession, so that, a couple times a year, they make something that's like good. And then every once in a while, they make something that really impacts the culture in a powerful way and can impact all the people that get to sit through this particular show, this work, where it just, wow, this one, it worked. It all gelled together. I find that actually quite inspiring. And in many ways, that was part of, I think, how Mark Fisher Fitness, I wouldn't say explicitly that per se, but MFF, which oddly we haven't really talked about much, but my gym that trains Broadway people, and it's very unusual. Part of the thing that's always felt best about it, I think part of the mission from day one, and certainly our avatars evolved, right? So I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't say that a massive percentage of our clientele current are performers, but we've always had a lot. And the thing that's always felt nice about that is nurturing and finding a way to take care of these impractical, dumb people. And I mean, as a comment, these dumb, impractical people, these artists that are unreasonable about their dreams and about making art and are willing to make these sacrifices that are so big on their professional, personal, physical, financial. I also say this is the husband of the 8-time Broadway veteran. My wife is a Broadway performer. So, I mean this in the most affectionate way possible, that is so impractical that I just desperately want to give them all a hug, in part because I also, part of that is an acknowledgement on my end that I couldn't do it. I got to a certain point in my life and other things that I wanted just superseded my desire to be an artist. And I'm very fortunate to have found something that still feels very creatively fulfilling with what I do. And I wouldn't say there for the grace of God go I. I'm certainly not saying that like what they're doing is like actually problematic. What I'm doing is actually so great. I think we just made different decisions, but I feel a deep allegiance, loyalty, and passion for actors and for artists and for people that are willing to travel all the roads you have to travel to make art as their livelihood. I think it's really inspiring.
Yeah. Well, especially in New York, there's such cross-section. I lived in New York for 2.5, 3 years. And, you've got the Wall Street folks, and you got the people that are, all about Fifth Avenue. Were you in New York in 2005?
Yeah.
Okay. I worked at Bed, the restaurant Bed that was like a nightclub, and it was where like Sex and the City was filmed there. And so I had this crazy existence where like actor by day, bottle service. One of the only places you could be a male waiter / bottle service server.
Wow. Okay.
In New York, but like it's just there's very few places that you can go besides the theater, where just theater people go, right? And especially a gym.
Yeah.
You go to these high end gyms like in Manhattan. Like forget about it. It's cost so much to get into those places, but it's like this is not an actor friendly necessarily environment or culture that gyms are created. They're created to pull in the people that have the money, honestly.
Yeah,
and
certainly.
So I love the idea that you really went all into like supporting this creative community in New York. And is your fitness is the gym in Manhattan or is it in Brooklyn?
It's in Manhattan. I mean, it's Hell's Kitchen. It is a walk-in stage door. That was really by design. My entire, my very first job as a personal trainer was the New York Sports Club next to the Nederlander, where Rent was playing at the time. So my entire professional career, the only place I've ever trained are within a 10-block radius. And there's been 3 or 4 different places but it's always been centered in Hell's Kitchen because it was not only where my social life was, it was also where my concurrent professional life was when I was also pursuing acting, but then also where many of our clients lived. But I'll tell you, it's been an interesting transition for us too, as I have grown and evolved as a business person, and New York City has evolved and changed. It's not a surprise, but it has been a difficult several years, and I think that's something too we're grappling with a little bit too, where understanding what we really need to charge to run our business in Mark Fisher Fitness makes it not the easiest thing for performers. We're working on some things around that. In fact, one thing we're planning to do, maybe not by the end of the year by this point, but in the very near term, is because historically, everything that's interesting about MFF is we've trained performers, but we've trained a lot of the behind the scenes people that have, frankly, steadier, in some cases, very good incomes, right? So we've worked with a lot of the general managers, the company managers, the people who make Broadway happen behind the scenes. And our hope is honestly to leverage some of those relationships to essentially become the preferred health and fitness vendor for Broadway shows. And in exchange, our plan is to essentially try to have dialogue. And again, it's fortunate many people have been clients at some point, not currently, and essentially see if we can't work out a deal where we give at least the Broadway community, who arguably is employed. Maybe that's maybe we should do something for unemployed actors. They get the discount, but make sure that the Broadway community gets a better rate, which could be done directly through the existing wellness programs of the company, or it could just be like, listen, if you're on the show, tell us, use this promo code, you'll get like X off. We want to make this easier for you. We want to support your body. We know it is hard to be in the theater, whether you're on stage or off, frankly, because a lot of the roles in the theater are very physically demanding. The hours are also very, very unusual. There's another thing too, is I've now become so interested in behind the scenes. I start to be like, wait, so the general manager works 65 hours a week every week? They work 6 days a week, 65 hours a week every week? That's a thing? And yeah, that's actually the thing. Yeah, they work a 9 to 5, and then they work into the show that night every night.
If it's a successful show, it's not stopping. Like, it's just perpetually going.
You never stop. 2-3 years. You can find ways to take some time off. But one of the things that I find just interesting about Broadway as an observation, of course, is the dynamics of that particular labor market. Because when you have a lot of people that want to work there, it just changes the economics. And not only that, but the other challenge Broadway has had, and I think there's some smart people working on this, and hopefully some of them can solve it, is there's no economy of scale. You can only fit so many people in there. It's not a matter of like, oh, well, it's this business is going so well, we're just going to scale it. There was hilariously a talk of actually adding a second theater of 42nd Street in I think it was early 80s, with the famous showman producer David Merrick, a highly controversial raconteur and producer. And that never happened. And it might have been an interesting model to try with something like Hamilton, but to some extent, the exclusivity is part of it. But then you also have this challenging proposition where, okay, well, we want to capitalize on the success of this product, so we just have to raise the rates in such a way that, well, now it's completely inaccessible for much of the population. There doesn't seem to be a good way to do it, because you just can only fit so many people in Broadway theater. But I will leave it to smarter people than me that know more about that to work on that and hopefully figure that out, because I don't have a good solve for that. And I think that's the core of a lot of these issues. It's a unique thing about Broadway, is it just doesn't scale.
Well, and that may be something in a different chapter of your life you helped solve. All right.
Perhaps. Honestly, nothing make me happier.
I want to make sure we spend some time with you as a fitness entrepreneur, because this is a big piece of who you are right now. Mark Fisher Fitness, really serving this community uniquely in Manhattan. So talk about kind of how this came about and what you guys are doing, how you're serving the community out there.
So Mark Fisher Fitness is a brick and mortar boutique fitness studio in New York City that was born largely out of my acting career. It was born in many ways to create a physical location for the training that I had been doing, which was largely with either members of the Broadway community or people Broadway adjacent, or people perhaps that for whatever reason didn't feel comfortable in traditional gym spaces and were drawn to our brand, which is very irreverent and quite subversive. So interested listeners can go to markfisherfitness.com or go to Instagram.com/@MFF Clubhouse is our handle there, and you'll see a lot of strange things. So our tagline is ridiculous humans, serious fitness. So that's always been our shtick, because my background is actually pretty rigorous academic strength and conditioning. And my hope was to create really good evidence-based training, nutrition, behavior change methodologies, but packaged in a way that was differentiated from a marketing perspective so people remember it, creative, so I felt satisfying because I'm leveraging my own eccentricities, and importantly, interesting and fun for the people that I wanted to work with, that I figured this would capture their attention. So again, we're not perfect like any other place. I don't think we nail either of these all the time. I think we're constantly having internal debates about, are we just being a normal gym now, right? And then conversely, we're also having conversations about, are we pushing the ridiculousness too far? Is this too many index cards? Like, what about undulating periodization? So I think we're in constant dialogue. Not that those two are inversely correlated. I don't think they need to be mutually exclusive, but that is our intention to do both of those things. And it's something we are constantly in dialogue about, is like, how do we honor both of those tenets?
Yeah, I think that's, and for those of you who haven't seen his website or don't follow on Instagram, do it, because you're really going to see what I love about it is that you're not trying to be everything to everybody. You're saying there is a group of people that are unique, that are looking for a special experience within the fitness community. Like that this gym is going to create this like fun, kind of ridiculous unicorns and this, and like just like all this kind of crazy fun, like theatrical stuff happening within the context of this truly scientific fitness program. Like where do you feel like you really succeed at that, and where do you feel like maybe you fall short?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, the places we succeed at that, I think certainly the culture of really teaching technique, which is a little bit unusual sometimes in a group fitness format. I think overall, there's a lot of effort on actually educating our clients on what we think are the best practices based on our interpretation of both real world results and anecdotal research. I think we succeed in that, and we've always placed a lot of emphasis on really rigorously educating our team. I think the places that we fail at that from a program, from a training piece is, listen, no doubt the sausage has to get made, and there are things you do differently because of the demands of scale. And I think that's maybe less to the fault of attempting to be ridiculous too, though sometimes, one probably could say, okay, we pushed like the fun a little too hard here and this was lacking some heft. But I think a lot of it has to do just with the model that we have, right? So, and at this point, I'm not overly, I think, smitten with any self-righteous requirements for what the thing needs to be. For the most part, I'm a fitness agnostic, and I want people moving, and I don't want them getting hurt. That's a lot of it, particularly with my clientele. And a lot of that is based on, when you look at the research for the way exercise improves health outcomes, you really need a minimum effective dose. So if people are enjoying it, if they're doing it consistently, if they're elevating their heart rate, if they are moving their joints through full range of motion, if they're lifting some weight, you're getting a lot of value out of that. So I think one can actually get overly precious in ways that are not helpful. You're throwing the baby out with the bathwater because it's just like not fun and it just doesn't matter for Gen Pop. And of course, this is distinct from the rarefied era of elite athletic performance, which does often, the details really will matter if you're working with an Olympian. But I do think that, it's hard to say that we're like actively failing at it, but I think, one thing I think we're going through right now is our staff has changed a lot over the past couple of years. And again, we've been open 12 years, so there's been many generations of MFF. And I think there's some of our team, I think, have great prospects, and I think they're just a little bit greener. So, so for instance, next year we are taking my whole team through Mike Boyle's certified functional strength coach certification. Sure. We'll also get everybody singing on the same page a little bit more. But yeah. I think if anything, that's kind of the main issue. I think some of the new trainers are just greener. They haven't had the time. They haven't had the exposure to either external resources or the internal training to get to the level that maybe we would like them to be. And admittedly, that's something of a horizon, right? I don't know if we ever reach the place where like, this is great. We're satisfied here. No more growth necessary here. It's kind of like not our bag. But I do think there's a current... Well, I wouldn't say I'm unhappy with what we're doing, but I do think there's definitely some clear opportunities that I expect we will capitalize on in the next 6 to 12 months to season and braise the greener trainers and the juices of really great strength conditioning, of understanding human movement, of understanding why the program designs are put together as such.
Well, hey, you have some online offerings. Is there, for a lot of people that don't live in New York City, is there any way they can engage with Mark Fisher Fitness from an online approach?
Yes. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. If they want to go to our website, we do offer online virtual classes. And oddly, in spite of it now being the winter of 2022, almost 2023, that is still hundreds and hundreds of people do that. That is the membership that they've chosen, which is made for strange days because our in-person is not nearly rebounded the way of almost any other gym that I know of. I think Midtown Manhattan has been particularly besotted by the various slings and arrows of the pandemic. However, uniquely of any other gym I know, we're still doing tons of online classes and tons of clients training from all over the world. So if they go to markfisherfitness.com, if they click on our services, they'll see we do offer 7 classes for $7 if you want to try it out with absolutely no pressure. But I will say that actually has been sort of fun to see what MFF is there. I think it's fair to say that's maybe an example of there are some limitations of your serious fitness when you're doing 30 people at a time on Zoom and you can't see them from the side and they don't have meaningful equipment to thoughtfully and incrementally increase load. That is not without its limitations. But I do think overall, again, we're doing the best we can within those constraints. And I think there are some really valuable logistic upsides and pluses to that have made us very happy to offer that and made a really great solution for some people that either the price point or the ability to train from their home makes it a way better option for them than coming to the physical clubhouse.
Yeah. We had to, in Camp Gladiator, we had to do that too, where everyone went virtual and then we came back outdoors in person. But like a lot of people were just like, hey, virtual so easy, I'm sticking with this. And other people were like, get me back outside. Like I need people. Right. And I think that's you see that with all ways that people are engaging with fitness these days. But I love that. And I think, this is great because you're in New York City. Not a lot of people that probably listen to my podcast are actually, boots on the ground in New York City. But hey, they could, if they're looking for kind of a unique style, they can come check you out online and at least experience what you guys are doing. I appreciate your time. This is awesome.
All right, man. Yeah, thank you so much for the time. Had a fun chat with you. This was delightfully all over the place. I hope the listeners enjoyed, but I had a great time.
That was my interview with Mark Fisher. That was actually done back in November of this last year. So he's got lots of stuff going on. Check out his website. Follow him on Instagram. It's fun. He's got some crazy fun stuff going on. And of course, he talked about the online option so you can check out some of his online workouts. Because a lot of people don't live in New York City. So, hey, if you're anywhere in the United States, you want to go online and do some workouts with him or with his crew, go ahead and go to the website to check that out. And I ask, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Like the video. If you want to share it with somebody, great. And if you want more content on these performers, especially the Broadway performers, check out Andrew Szymanski. He has a great interview. He's a Broadway singer. I've got Michael Oberholzer, who's a Broadway actor, and then Brittany Conagati. She's also a Broadway dancer, actor, really triple threat. All 3 of those great interviews you can find on this YouTube channel or on any of the apps that you listen to podcasts on. Thanks again for listening to the Mindset Forge podcast.